Hi guys, this is Cecilia from Red Hands, and today I'm doing a book review on Jonathan Safran Foer's book, Eating Animals. Today's format's going to be a little bit more structured than usual because I'm going to be reading almost word for word what I've written down in the review. I want to make sure that I'm hitting all the points that I want to hit and that I'm reading the quotes correctly. So, yeah, let's get started. The premise of this book is based on the idea that people eat meat culturally, and even their understanding of how animals are raised is deeply rooted in the folklore that's been ingrained in us for several generations. The factory farm is a relatively recent invention, the first factory farms being established at around 1926. The author states that people often rationalize the process of eating meat for health and cultural reasons, but also because they believe that meat production is really only cool in the last few minutes of the animals' lives. On page 35, the author writes, "Factory farming success depends on consumers' nostalgic images of food production. The fisherman reeling in fish, the pig farmer knowing each of his pigs as individuals, the turkey rancher watching beaks break eggs, because these images correspond to something we respect and trust." This is his basic argument throughout the book. I have some issues with it, but I'll get to that in a bit. What he's saying is that people have constructed a false happy life for the animals that eventually become their meals. And as a result, they can rationalize ending a life for nutrients. Foer seems to believe that if people understood the kinds of lives and the horrific deaths that face 99% of animals killed for meat, that this illusory image that we've created would be shattered and would thereby destroy their desire for meat. For Foer, this book is an ethical stance against factory farming, so keep that in mind as you're reading. His objective seems to be to find the least extreme form of protest against animal cruelty. As a journalist, I think he's trying to produce as an unbiased view as possible by consulting a range of different people, such as farmers, factory farmers, activists, etc. But my general feeling about his choices are that in the end, they all make the same statement, and that's even as a vegetarian or a vegan, you can be involved in animal agriculture and still be ethical, as long as you're trying to improve the conditions. My main issue with that, of course, is that in the end, he's really presenting people who all have the same opinion he does. That the issue with animal agriculture is inhumane farming and killing and not speciesism. But I think this is some kind of appeal to the general public as well. Even if he really feels this way, pushing people in that direction can only have a positive impact at this point. In the end, he makes it very clear that he's chosen to abstain from meat because it's impossible to obtain ethically, even from ranchers and farms that go through laborious processes to raise their animal ethically. Many of the same companies still struggle with finding slaughterhouses using humane processes. Foer talks extensively about visiting the Neiman Ranch, run by Paul and his wife Phyllis, who's a vegetarian. This ranch is exceptional in its humane practices, allowing pigs to live out their normal social lives outside of confinement. Both Paul and Phyllis believe their style of ranching is the future of animal agriculture. It's sustainable, humane, and better for everyone involved. But as he quoted from one factory farmer, "Do you think family farms are going to sustain a world of 10 billion? Not to mention that by the end of the book, the Neiman Ranch was taking a turn in the opposite direction, indicating that smaller, ethical farms aren't sustainable either. I think Foer is pushing for humane practices in smaller farm sizes for both the animals and the farmers, but essentially, the argument becomes more about big business being the issue, rather than animal suffering. Larger corporations can afford to dispose of animal waste illegally and pay the fines. They can afford to calculate in percentages of loss because it's more profitable to squeeze greater quantities of animals into smaller cages and let some of them die than to give them the needed room to live in a decent life. So in this aspect, Foer casts himself on the side of the farmer and the animals simultaneously. One of the good points that Foer makes is about the myth of consent. He writes, "The myth of consent has many versions, but all imply a fair deal, and at least metaphorically, animal complicity in their own domestication and slaughter." And then goes on to write, "By this logic, enslaving a group of humans is acceptable if the proposed alternative were non-existence." This myth is something that we've worked into our culture and helps us to perpetuate the idea that we have some type of right to an animal's body because we take care of it. Now I think Foer is saying that we're violating that myth. So even if you believe that kind of folklore can rationalize unnecessary behavior, we're not even adhering to that kind of domestication. That's the type of cognitive dissidence Foer is talking about in his book. I personally think that the myth is a weak argument for animal agriculture to begin with. As Foer hints, it was at one point probably the kind of rationale that led people to enslave other people. It's another aspect of our culture for us to examine when we consider how and why we eat animals. Foer makes a couple statements in the conclusion of his book that I'd like to mention. The first is, the idea of a just farm system rooted in the best traditions of animal welfare and the idea of a vegetarian farm system rooted in an animal rights ethic are both strategies for reducing, never eliminating, the violence inherent in being alive. They aren't just opposing values, as is often portrayed. They represent different ways of getting a job done that both agree needs doing. They reflect different institutions about human nature, but they both appeal to compassion and prudence. I understand what he's trying to do here, and it's what he's been trying to do throughout the entirety of the book, and that's build some bridges between those who believe meat can be raised humanely and those who believe that any use of animal is wrong because it can't give its consent to use its body. But for myself, and I'm sure for other fellow vegans, you can see where this argument seems weak. Of course vegans want animals to be raised humanely, but the end objective is to eliminate animal agriculture completely, as it's seen as inherently harmful and completely unnecessary. So I don't really agree with the example of the vegan who designs factory farms that Foer uses in his book. For me, that isn't an ethical vegan, but of course there are those who would disagree. Foer later writes, "It shouldn't be the consumer's responsibility to figure out what's cruel and what's kind, what's environmentally friendly and what's sustainable. Cruel and destructive products should be illegal. We don't need the option of buying children's toys made with lead paint or aerosols with chlorofluorocarbons, or medicines with unlabeled side effects, and we don't need the option of buying factory-farmed animals." As a vegan, I would say we don't need the option of buying any animals' bodies at all. But more importantly, what I see him doing here again is directing the argument at big business and not at animal agriculture itself. He's not wrong, of course. If these institutions weren't so huge, they wouldn't be able to get away with all the crazy things that they can. But this kind of paradigm allows people to put the blame on others and ignores their own power in the situation. It really removes the impact the individual choices have on society as a whole. We see that 400 million fewer animals were slaughtered this year as opposed to 2009. And I don't think it's because the government cracked down on the industry. It's because individuals made choices that resulted in a lower demand for the animal agriculture supply. So overall, I think this is a really good resource for those interested in learning the finer details of factory farming, and it's definitely worth a read. But as an ethical vegan, I have some issues with the way the overall message was portrayed. It seemed to take a lot of middle ground and to be almost pandering to a sort of masochistic audience who wanted to hear how horrible things were, but didn't want to feel all that bad about eating meat. Which is unfortunate, because for me, that meant that it really fell short of its potential. But once again, it's a really good resource on factory farming. Just make sure that you read with caution. Alright guys, that was my review of Jonathan Safran Foer's book, Eating Animals. I hope that you really enjoyed it. If you've read the book already and you want to let me know what you think of the book in the comments below, or if you want to let me know what you think about what I think of the book in the comments below, I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. My next book review will be on animal liberation, and I hope to have that out soon. Bye!